Raising the Bar podcast, brought to you by the Association of Gray's Inn Students.
On this episode, we will be discussing Vocalise, a student-led prison debating initiative that was founded in Gray's Inn. Join me today in my conversation with two of the current co-directors of Vocalise.
Prisoners really value education and the work that the education departments do. They're seeing these volunteers come in and teach them and listen to their opinions for a number of hours on a Friday afternoon, say, when we could be doing anything else with our freedom. And they get very excited to see us.
I guess it's an opportunity to have communal discussions in the way that possibly they don't otherwise get. So in those moments of human connection, let's max it out and discuss everything from, whether cats and dogs are better to what the afterlife is.
There's nothing really more challenging than going into a Category A prison and debating against a group of inmates why rehabilitation should not be a purpose of justice system or something like that, choosing a really controversial topic. And regardless of whether I end up practicing criminal law or not, that's going to stay with me.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the Raising the Bar podcast. My name is Hafsa Yousfi, and in today's episode, we will be discussing Vocalise, a student-led prison debating initiative that was founded by two members of Gray's Inn. It's an interesting story, actually. As a student member of Gray's Inn, Alex Just was inspired to start Vocalise after witnessing a debate coaching program run by Professor Sam Nelson in the US. Along with fellow co-founder Florence Iveson, these two students approached Gray's Inn with what at the time seemed like an incredibly ambitious plan: to turn law students into debate coaches and run classes in prisons across London. 15 years later, Vocalise is still running and is an award-winning initiative which helps to rehabilitate prisoners through the medium of debate. Joining me today are two of the current co-directors of Vocalise, Finnean Robinson and Ava Chowdhury-Turner. Finnean, welcome.
Thanks.
It's good to see you, Ava.
Very good to see you too, Hafsa.
So, could you briefly describe what Vocalise is?
Vocalise is a prison debating initiative run out of Gray's Inn, in which GDL and Bar Course students go into a variety of London prisons to teach debating and public speaking skills to prisoners. It's been going on here for about a decade and a half and is really well received both by prisoners and enjoyed by the mentors who go in to teach.
Ava, could you describe what the process of being a mentor is like?
So being a mentor, so it kind of starts off by having a period of mentor training. And I found quite interesting and different about the Vocalise training is that you are essentially taught the course that you will then teach. And that's kind of particularly useful for me as someone with no formal debating prior experience. And it kind of puts you on quite like a level playing field with the prisoners when you go in, because you're teaching it to them and you have literally just been sort of taught it yourself. Yeah, you're going to the prisons and you are there for a 6-week course, each session focusing on a different aspect of debating.
We start by defining what emotion is. So debates are always framed in the format, this house believes, or this house would. And so teaching what that means to prisoners is usually where we start. And it is quite a difficult concept to grasp at first, the idea of a premise. And we use a variety of analogies to get prisoners to understand what exactly it is they're doing. And the one that I think both of us really like is the sports team analogy, where you may have grown up in Manchester, but you're now playing for Chelsea. And it doesn't matter the team you sport growing up, it's the idea that you're going to give it all on the pitch that day for the side that you're assigned for that debate. And once prisoners start to understand that it's less about their own beliefs and more about finding a way to argue for the topic they're given, they get really passionate about it.
Yeah, because I think for a lot of prisoners, realistically, they do debate actually quite a lot day to day. They haven't got much else to do other than use their words to have fun. So they kind of spend a lot of time talking to each other and arguing about things. But the whole point, the difference with Vocalise, the difference with debating is that you're not arguing for what you necessarily believe in. Sometimes you are, and that's good, and you can bring in your own experiences. But most of the time you have to be ready just to defend something that you absolutely don't agree with.
Something I found really interesting when I went in was that I initially thought some of the more softball debating topics like this house believes dogs are better than cats would have a better reception. But really, the prisoners want to get into the nitty-gritty stuff.
Yeah.
And it's really debates about the prison system itself or flaws in justice as a society which get them most motivated, because they have opinions and they have experiences which they want to share with us as mentors who've never been into a prison before. And giving them the platform and opportunity to speak about that is really interesting for us and really exciting for them.
How do the prisoners relate to you as mentors? Do they look at you as young, fresh-faced students who don't really know how prison works, or do they respect you? How does that dynamic work?
I think probably a bit of both. I think probably in the first lesson you're, a little bit perhaps stumbly and kind of like, okay, this is definitely my first time doing this. But for a lot of them, it's also their first time, public speaking. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic because you're both sort of learning these oracy skills as you go together, but yet you've obviously come from completely different experiences. And I think, so it was quite interesting, especially in HMP ISIS, there was a massive thing about not allowing anyone to vape in class. And quite early on, like we got pulled aside and we were told by the education staff, you cannot let them do that. Like that was our responsibility to stop them. So that was quite
intense.
Interesting. And so I had to, from quite early on, I was like, I'm going to put my foot down, just say like, in this space, you're not allowed to vape. And they'd be like, but don't you vape? And I was like, well, that's not the point about my own personal views on vaping. And actually, let's make this into a debate. That's the whole point, I'm not telling you what I'm telling you because it's what I necessarily believe in, like debating.
So when you both joined Vocalise, did you join it very confident, very capable of debating, or was this something that you developed as you partook in Vocalise?
I think I definitely developed it along the way. I've done a bit of debating, I've done some mooting and greys, but one of the reasons which I wanted to join Vocalise in the first place was to learn that skill. And I really believe that the best way to learn a skill is by teaching it. And there's nothing really more challenging than going into a category A prison and debating against a group of inmates why rehabilitation should not be a purpose of justice system or something like that, choosing a really controversial topic. And I've had the most difficult interventions and debates from these prisoners, not from moots and greys. And I remember when I was doing the Jessup moot, I deliberately signed myself up for a number of debates in prisons just to get used to responding to these on-the-cuff, quite aggressive interventions as a way of practicing it before going and doing a moot in front of KCs and judges instead.
How do you think prisoners perform in this more structured environment?
I think prisoners, they're not, as I said, they're not used to having that sort of structure to their arguments or debates. But by the end of it, they completely come into it, and there's a reason why pretty much every single time the prison team will beat the student barrister team, because they are just actually much more engaging. And this, I think by the time you're doing the bar training, a lot of students have sort of come into these rigid ways of advocacy, and obviously it's really good, and it might get all the points right and you've got all the research, but are you actually being very engaging? Do you really want to listen to you for 5-10 minutes even? But when it comes to the prisoners, you're almost much more excited to listen to them because they just bring a lot more energy.
But the level of focus as well when you're doing a debate in prison is something else, because there's such little educational provision in prison, and this is often the only chance that these prisoners will get to be together or debating something like this for the week. And sometimes you'll come in and they've been thinking about things which you'd have mentioned a week ago and forgotten yourself, and suddenly they're challenging you on these points. And the level of sort of focus on your words as you say them, it really is something else, and quite a challenge.
It's interesting that you mentioned educational provisions. Obviously, that's been a issue within the criminal justice system generally, of how little time prisoners are out of their cells, for example, and how little provisions are available to help them rehabilitate. What do you think the benefit of participating in a scheme like Vocalise is for the prisoners?
I think at the heart of Vocalise is teaching oracy skills. Obviously that comes out in the sort of medium of debate, but I'm a massive proponent for the sort of transformative power that oracy can have in terms of, verbal communication, but also confidence, body language, critical thinking, interpersonal skills, like listening. And all of those skills are so important, build on your own ability so that you can sort of go much further.
Something I pick up on in that, and I completely agree with the list that Ava said, is empathy. which we've discussed quite a lot actually. When you're listening to someone and you're trying to work out why their argument is effective, you have to put yourself in their shoes. And to be a good debater, you have to approach a problem from a number of angles and consider how different groups of people see it. And that's something I find most moving about the debates we do on things like the prison system, where prisoners are having to put themselves in the shoes of, say, their victims, or put themselves in the shoes of the wider public or their children, and examining issues of the justice system from multiple angles which aren't just that of a prisoner within it. It's a skill, and it's something which I think they don't get to do a huge amount. And so that public speaking, that critical thinking, but also that empathetic skill as well.
Do you think the benefit of that is potentially a greater capacity to engage with society upon release?
Absolutely. I think it's about being able to tackle a situation using your critical thinking skills and your word skills rather than just your instantaneous response. Something that one of our co-directors, Lizzie, really brought to Vocalise this year was sort of teaching the impact that trauma can have on how people respond to situations. And of course, the vast majority of those in prison have faced trauma from a childhood age. And so now we do part of when we teach the future debate mentors, one session that we've added is trauma-informed learning. And Lizzie, who's worked for years with offenders, explains how trauma that you've had in the past can impact your immediate response to other people and in terms of how you form relationships. And so I think, learning oracy and debate kind of changes maybe how you respond to a situation.
And it gives you the tools to express yourself better. It's not necessarily that we're going in and teaching prisoners how to think differently. It's more how to word their thoughts in a way which gets received. And one of the reasons that I signed up to Vocalise was I was doing some pro bono work for a charity which dealt with complaints within prison, and would get these written notes or calls from prisoners, and they'd be completely indecipherable. And you would sense that there's the nugget of a complaint there, or an abuse of power by the prison guards or prison system, but be unable to work out head or tail of what it actually is, because it's caught up in this whirlwind of frustration and anger, and they've not really been taught how to express themselves properly. And giving them a structured way to do this is really important, not just for, say, job interviews after prison, but ensuring that their rights are protected within prison. And also giving them a different avenue to express their emotions, an alternative to lashing out, and giving a sort of structured reason as to why they feel so aggrieved at a certain thing.
I imagine when you're dealing with prisoners, there's a very varied level of education amongst the population. How do you deal with, for example, let's say someone whose first language isn't English? What support is provided within this scheme?
Well, the scheme which we're running in H&P Belmarsh this year is with the English as a second language classes. And we felt it was really important to do this because those without English as a first language have the highest rate of suicide in prison. And this is partly borne out because of their frustration and alienation and isolation and just inability to express themselves and their thoughts and be listened to. And going in, and usually they have a basic level of English from their previous classes, but we really focus on getting them confident speaking in it. And if you go and learn a language yourself, you'll notice that ability to just try and fail and improve is really critical in developing skills in language. And so we've just finished our February cycle in HP Belmarsh with a class of 12, and they had a mixture of Spanish, Albanian, Mandarin as their first languages, yet every single one of them either did a 4-minute speech in a debate at the end or stood up and made a 1-minute intervention about things in the prison system which they really care about. And the focus of this one was the need for more education in the prison system. And it was really quite emotional seeing these prisoners expressing things which are really important to them and their daily life, which they've not been able to articulate. And on the basis of a 6-week course taught entirely by volunteer bar students, are managing to put these complaints across to a judge who's a visiting member of the bar and the education department in prison who are also there on the day.
That's fascinating. It's interesting that you said it's emotional, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you both is, how do you reconcile, dealing with these people as students, essentially, whilst knowing that they are in prison for having committed offences, and in some circumstances, violent offences?
What I really like about about how Vocalise is taught, and what our sort of rules are when we go in, one of the big ones is you don't know what anyone's in for, and you don't ever ask them that. It's a really important environment, I think, for them to learn in, because you're just approaching them as a person who is there to learn and to develop themselves. For them to properly develop in the short time that we have, I think it's important that you don't have any barriers to how you interact with them.
It's a really important learning experience for mentors to go in as well, because many mentors want to go to a criminal bar where they'll be necessarily either prosecuting these people or defending them. And getting this experience of going into prison, meeting these people, understanding that they are human beings regardless of what they've done, it's a really important environment for our mentors to learn in, because it's what they're going to have to do in their daily practice for the rest of their lives.
Is that what drew you both to Vocalise, wanting to practice at the criminal bar, or was it something else?
I think that that's some component of it, but before doing law, when I did anthropology and sort of my social sciencey background, I was always quite interested in prisons and rehabilitation. So, just even from like the architecture of a prison and how that impacts the way prisoners feel and are treated, to different methods of rehabilitation, such as obviously education. Now more than ever, we need to be focusing on rehabilitation methods that are actually kind of moving away from this punitive method of prisoning, because it's just not working, and we're in an absolute crisis. So I think part of my drive towards it was definitely a sort of passion for trying to, in some small way help the police, prison.
both, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Help the sort of prison situation we're in. But the other side of that is also just my belief in how important oracy teaching is for everyone.
I feel very similarly. I've been fortunate enough to have a very good education, and I'm here studying a bar course in Gray's Inn, and most of the time when you go into prisons, it's people who've been deprived of that prior to arriving. And the thing which I think impacted me most from the first time I taught in HMP Thameside was the number of people with learning difficulties, so dyslexia specifically, which is something I share, and the lack of support that they've had throughout their entire life, and their inability to really read words off a page because they'd never been taught the skills in school of how to do that. And that experience made me really want to continue working with Vocalise as a director to try and reform the course to make it more friendly to people with specific learning difficulties, and to give our mentors the tools to go in and teach people like this. I think 80% of people in Belmarsh, of prisoners in Belmarsh, have learning difficulties. And most of these aren't picked up on throughout their time in primary or secondary school education, or even education within prison.
Do prisoners ever disclose their personal experiences or difficulties with yourselves?
Yeah, all the time. I think actually, especially in Downview, a lot of our time was actually just spent talking about the difficulties that they were facing. A massive thing that came up, especially in the women's prison, was that their sort of discontent with the category system, not within the prison as a whole, but within each prison you have different categories of prisoners who it's kind of like it's meant to be a sort of reward scheme, but in their eyes it's become sort of more of a punishment, where good behaviour means that they'll get to see pictures of their family, or they'll get to do more courses and that kind of thing, and have more time out of their cell. But the other side to that is that if they misbehave, then they are not allowed to see pictures of their kids, and then obviously that makes them more angry, and the emotional sort of attachment, especially for a lot of these women, that you have to your children, means that when you're denied that right, that's going to make you act out even more, and then you just get in a cycle. And they were saying I think it almost became like a punishment system.
Some might argue that that's what prison is for, to punish people.
There's obviously a punitive element to the prison system, but it seems to be failing in every other aspect of its work. And the number of prisoners who I speak to who've been bounced around the prison system, and they may have 6 months left of their sentence, but they already know that they're going to be in again in a year, is quite astonishing. What's more, a lot of the prisoners that we met there aren't actually sentenced. Many of them are on remand. They've not actually been found guilty yet, but they may have been in prison for 6 months, say, awaiting a sentence, being punished, being deprived of their family without necessarily having been found guilty of that crime. There was one person in my class at Thameside who had turned himself in and had now been in prison longer than his sentence was going to be.
You mentioned the first time you went into prison, which HMP Thameside. Is that right, Finnean?
Yes, which we both taught at.
Yeah.
Was that the first prison for both of you?
Yeah, so Finnean did the first 3 weeks, but because of their policy, I then and my group came in for the last 3 weeks.
What was it like the first time going into a prison?
So I'd been into a prison once before, briefly, when I was working as a paralegal. And I mean, even that was a bit of a baptism of fire, because I went in and the solicitor was like an hour late, and she was like, well, it's so hard to actually get these lots of prisoners, just go in. And I was in like my first month of being a criminal paralegal, could not advise. So I basically went and met this man. I think in my head I thought, oh, he's going to be like in a cell, or there was going to be some bars between us where he's at least going to be handcuffs. And it's like, nope, we just put in a little room, just you two. I remember the like emergency button was like on his side. So I was like, okay. And
in case he needed to be let out.
And I was like, well, I literally can't, I really don't feel qualified to advise you on your Section 18 hearing, but I can just make some small talk. So yeah, we just chatted a bit. So I guess that was
I'm sure he loved it.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was quite nice for us both, probably. But yeah, so then going into Vocalise is like a very different experience, because, you know, I mean, what I really remember though is you going through the security, which is obviously really hostile naturally, and then the beginning bit is very prison-y because it is prison, but then suddenly you get into the education department, and I especially remember it in Thameside. It's like a very distinct, different building. I don't know if I'm like romanticising it a bit in my head, but I definitely remember being quite amazed by how different it feels in the education centre. Everyone's just like more engaged and quite calm and really polite. And I've never have felt safer amongst loads of men than walking through Thameside.
Prisoners really value education and the work that the education departments do. And it is intimidating going in, but the education spaces do feel a lot safer and more secure in the prison, just because the prisoners are so excited to be there. And they're so excited to see us come in. And from their perspective, they're seeing these volunteers come in and teach them and listen to their opinions for a number of hours on a Friday afternoon, say, when we could be doing anything else with our freedom. And they get very excited to see us. And it is a bit of a weird atmosphere in that first class in particular, where not only are the mentors and prisoners sizing each other up, but the prisoners often are sizing each other up, and they may not have been in the same class before. It may be their only chance to interact with one another. And so often you do come out of that very first class feeling a bit shaken, and oh my God, I've got 6 weeks more of trying to persuade these prisoners to even talk, let alone debate. But by the time you roll around to the 6th class, it's actually difficult to get them to stop talking, and that's more of the issue.
That's great.
Yeah, and I really found particularly that all of the quiet ones, I don't know if you had this in the first session, the people that were really quiet, they'd obviously have the naturally like, classroom clowns kind of thing. But by the end, by the final week, those loud people would just be the quietest in the room, and it would always be the people that had been the quietest at the beginning who were taking like the lead speaking roles.
Absolutely.
And it's like as soon as they'd tapped into like this strength that they had that they maybe didn't realise they had because they're not the big, funny one, they had so much confidence and they were just absolutely stealing the show.
Did you hear back from any prisoners after the schemes were run to, for like testimonials or how they found the experience?
I mean, something I'm trying to do at the moment is to get an article in Inside Times, which is the prison newspaper, which is going to be, I'm hoping to get it co-authored by some of our Vocalise mentors and some of the prisoners which we've taught. And so as part of that, we've been getting their testimonials, their feedback. And one of the big things which keeps coming up is how much they respect the mentors for just listening to them. And one other really nice testimonial that we got recently was from a prisoner in Belmarsh who, at the conclusion of the final debate of the cycle, came up to the visiting judge in prison and said that the Vocalise programme was the first time in his nearly a decade inside Belmarsh that had felt like he was more than just a sentence and was a human being with his own thoughts and opinions.
That's quite impactful. The idea for this podcast actually came about when I ran into you both at the Bridge Bar and you were delivering a talk to the Ministry of Justice about Vocalise. So just wanted to ask what your successes and achievements have been through Vocalise over the past few years.
I think the fact we keep getting invited back. And these education departments are really strapped for resources and have a very hard job. And yet they continually go out of their way to make time for us to come in and teach. And we've got these very enduring relationships with a number of prisons and keep getting offers to go into new ones.
How many prisons and how many prisoners are you working with at the moment?
Oh, that's a difficult question.
Yeah. Well, this year we've sort of expanded, I think, even from last year. And the last few years we've sort of been building it back up. So this year we've trained about 70 mentors, teaching in 8 prisons, I want to say.
Yeah, I think we've got 8 prisons on our list this year.
Yeah.
But we might be teaching in different departments on that. So I think we're teaching in 2 different parts of Brixton, for example. And then we're trying to do some back of the napkin maths for the MOJ about how many prisoners we've taught, because we have fluctuating classes and people sometimes get released or get sent to another prison. So it's a bit difficult to tally up the numbers. But we think around 450 prisoners this year, and that's only going to increase by the end of the year. I'd love if we can get to 500.
Yeah.
That's a significant impact. It's quite impressive that it's just students, essentially. What are your most memorable experiences of Vocalise?
I think a big one, which sort of touches on something we discussed earlier, is the feeling of getting some of the prisoners to finally argue something that they really don't believe in. And I used to have quite a lot of fun of talking about a debate topic, getting them to sort of suggest it. There's one of our final ones we did on whether we should abolish jury trials. And actually one of the prisoners was very pro getting rid of jury trials. And he was talking about this for ages. And I was like, yeah, okay, kind of egging him on. And then I was like, right, well, you're going to argue against this. And in the end, he did it. And he delivered the main speech. And it was 3 minutes long. And then I just sort of looked at him and I was like, yeah. Do you remember who you were an hour ago? And he was like, yeah.
So he was arguing against what he had been quite vociferously arguing for
absolutely.
to you. Oh, wow.
And I think that was really fun. And then they I think they kind of have a moment of realization oh, interesting. There are more sides to this than I kind of realized.
One I really enjoyed in Thameside is the balloon game, which the premise is everyone in the class is in a hot air balloon. And it's plummeting towards the ground, and you need to get rid of the weight by throwing various people out. And so the prisoners are debating about who they should throw out and why they should stay in the balloon personally. And there's always a moment in the class where they realise that they can lie, and suddenly went down this rabbit hole of who had the power to send who to hell, and it ended up in this sort of big religious debate between a number of Rastafarians and Muslims in the class. Just a fascinating sort of bit of insight into how we all think about the afterlife, which was not something I was anticipating happening in a prison debating class.
I guess it's an opportunity to have communal discussions in the way that possibly they don't otherwise get. So in those moments of human connection, let's max it out and discuss everything from, whether cats and dogs are better to what the afterlife is.
Yeah. I think when you relay these stories, people are like, oh my God, you're just teaching them to lie. But it's no, they're not some other breed of people that should never, have a bit of fun in a game. And I think it's quite interesting, developing skills like convincing people that what you're telling is the truth, but it not having sort of moral or illegal consequences. It's you're just doing it for the purpose of the game, and no, it's fine and it's fun.
And a lot of the persuasive skills that we're teaching are really going to get put to use in I deserve a second chance, or I deserve an opportunity at this job. And ways that they can express what they've done in the past, how they've reformed themselves and what they want to do going forward. And that's why we get such buy-in from the class. Those are the skills that they want to develop and use.
Do you think prisoners are generally hopeful about their chances of rehabilitation?
Yeah, there's a number of different views, I think, amongst prisoners that I've taught on that. And I remember a certain class where young boys who were maybe 19, 20, who had, I don't know what they were in there for, but they certainly had a whole life ahead of them when they were coming out and were very eager to make use of that. One of the things that this experience teaches you is that people are still individuals in prison, and they haven't lost their personality, they haven't lost the sort of distinctions between them. And prison often treats people as a monolithic, prisoners as a very monolithic group. But there's a lot of diversity between them.
Yeah. Finnean and I were having a conversation a few days ago, and we were talking about this very topic and how it's so easy to remove the humanity from the prisoner because you think this person has done something wrong and they become just one of many who are, confined to this place where they are kept separate from society because we need them to be kept separate from society. I imagine it's interesting to then undermine that preconception potentially that people might have by going into prisons and actually holding a mentorship role over these people who are actually quite vulnerable within society, considering the lack of educational resources that they have and the lack of contact with the outside world in some cases, I imagine.
One of the points raised by a prisoner in the last debate I did on should prisons be a place of punishment or rehabilitation was that he couldn't be rehabilitated on 2 lessons a week. And it's ludicrous to expect him to be able to go into the outside world and be released and have a normal life when he's got a very visible criminal record and has had, as you said, 2 lessons a week for the past 6 years or so to get him to that point.
Yeah. It's quite interesting because one of the sort of roots of this of debating in prisons is a prison that was set up in the late 1920s in America called Norfolk Prison, and that was designed by a Harvard sociology student. And he set it up to not look like a prison because he wanted it to look like a community. So when you went in, there was a library and a sports hall and a community centre. And they'd get people from the community to come in and teach courses. And they were actually the first prison to do prison debating. And it's where Malcolm X famously debated for 2 years in late 1940s. And I think that's quite a pioneering model in terms of rehabilitation because you didn't have that distinct barrier. But then, towards the second half of the 20th century, I think we've moved away from that completely. And in that particular prison, I know that, they stopped doing debating or any other sort of community courses in sort of the 60s, 70s. And then the US and the UK has moved towards a much more punitive sort of style of prison, and now we're in this massive crisis. So I think we need to rethink the sort of direction we've gone in.
I think it's really important for the mentors who are going to prison, and often they're going to end up as prosecutors. Often they're going to end up being a barrister in a prosecuting role, potentially arguing before a judge that prison is the best solution to this person's problem, or that this person should not be let out on bail. And I think it's absolutely vital that future barristers see the inside of a prison before they're put in that position where they're having to argue for someone to spend their life there or to spend years there.
As first mentors and now co-directors of Vocalise, what would be your pitch to students who are considering participating in the Vocalise scheme?
I think I'd say, coming to the law is not just about giving people a voice in a legal sense. I think it's important to remember that you can also use your experiences and abilities to help people develop their speaking skills and their communication skills, and you can have as big an impact on people probably in that way as you can legally, and that both are very important.
I'd say that if you want to work in the justice system and want to spend your career shaping it, and even if that's in a civil capacity or in a criminal one, it's really important to understand the whole thing holistically and to see all the moving parts. And it's particularly important if you want to go into criminal law, where you may be spending most of your time in a courtroom rather than a prison, but those two things are intrinsically attached. And it's really important to understand that experiences don't stop when there's that sentence or that guilty verdict. I've learned a huge amount by going to prisons and about how our justice system works as overall, about individuals who get caught up in the justice system and can't really seem to escape it. It's not a place I thought I would be going into in my life, and I'm really, really glad that I do, and I feel like I've got a much better understanding of how prisons work, of the lives of people within them from Vocalise. And regardless of whether I end up practicing criminal law or not, that's going to stay with me.
That was, I think, a conversation I was having with someone about prisons. It's similar in a way to how disability works, in a sense of potentially you might expect it to be something so distant from you, so far removed, that you might never have to experience it. But even, for example, you could be a law-abiding citizen, get into a tragic accident in your car, and now you're in prison for manslaughter.
Well, that's exactly what happened to one of the prisoners. It was, post-university, car accident, they died, and that's it, 10 years, and she just never thought, obviously, her life would go that way.
So I think it's important societally to view this as something that, this is a point at which any of us could one day hit. And therefore, let's make these spaces something where, God forbid, someone does end up there. They are tolerable and they actually serve a societal function rather than simply put people away for years and years and then throw them into the world with no skills or capabilities to reintegrate. For students wanting to join Vocalise, what are the next steps for them to take?
Well, definitely sign up when we do the big next cohort. But in the meantime, there are opportunities to debate prisoners, which is a great way to sort of get some experience, not teaching, but being part of the debate. And that will be going on for the next few months.
Maybe we can create a link to publicise this podcast as a sign-up sheet for debating. I'd also encourage anyone who's been teaching with Vocalise this year. In the autumn, we'll be looking for new directors, of course, and it's been an incredibly rewarding experience. And I feel like I've learned so much about, when you're a mentor, you learn a lot about the prisoners, but when you're directing it, you actually have to work quite closely with the prison education departments. And I've got just a huge appreciation for the work they do in such challenging environments with often very difficult students, and always putting their welfare first and doing this absolutely vital functions in our society of rehabilitating people. So if you've been teaching with us this year and you're interested in taking it further, do reach out to Ava or myself about what it involves to be a director, and we'll be happy to give you any tips and look forward to seeing your applications.
That's great. Thank you both so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
If you're interested in participating in Vocalise or learning more about it, there will be links available in the episode notes. In part 2 of this podcast, we welcome to the conversation Joe Tarbert, the head of programs at Standout, a criminal justice charity that aims to empower prisoners as they rejoin society. Please do share the podcast with like-minded friends, give us a quick rating and review, and we'll see you next time for part 2.